fastest growing religion on earth just hit 2 billion followers, and it's in more trouble than it's ever been. Not because Muslims are leaving, most aren't. Not because mosques are emptying, in many places they're full, but because something far more dangerous is happening inside Islam than mass apostasy. The people who control it are losing their grip, and the generation replacing them, well, they're not asking for permission. This is how the next generation of Muslims can be the last generation of Islamic authority as we have known it. To understand what's breaking, you need to understand what held it together for so long. Now, for centuries, Islam wasn't just a religion in the way that most Westerners think of religion. A private belief, something you practice on Sundays or keep to yourself. In much of the Muslim world, Islam was the operating system. It governed courts, contracts, inheritance, marriage, dietary law, seasonal rhythms, and the moral vocabulary through which entire societies understood right and wrong. To be born in this world was to be born inside a system, and that system was total. And religious authority wasn't centralized the way the Catholic Church was. There was no single pope. Instead, it was distributed, spread across scholars, judges, teachers, Sufi masters, and local clerics whose legitimacy came from proximity, reputation, and the slow movement of information. If you had a question about inheritance law, you would ask the neighborhood jurist. If you needed a ruling on a contract, you went to the Qadi. If your child needed education, the madrasa provided it, along with the moral framework that came attached. This was a layered ecosystem of learning and social control so thick, so deeply woven into daily life, that questioning it wasn't just taboo. It was almost structurally impossible. You couldn't challenge what you couldn't compare. And for centuries, the average person had nothing to compare it to. Books were rare. Literacy was limited. Travel was dangerous. The horizon of your moral world ended at the edge of your community. That system survived invasions. It survived the Mongols. It survived colonial occupations and the rise of modern nation-states. In many places, post-colonial governments actually folded religious institutions directly into state machinery. Ministries of religious affairs, nationalized endowments, state-controlled religious curricula. From Morocco to Malaysia, from Egypt to Pakistan, governments recognized that controlling the mosques meant controlling the people. Religion didn't just shape identity. It became a tool of governance, a weapon of legitimacy, a way for rulers to claim divine backing for very earthly power. And that's where the fault line begins. Because when faith is tied to state power, a theological disagreement doesn't stay theological. It becomes political, constitutional, explosive. And when young people start questioning the clerics, they're not just questioning God, they're questioning the government. That makes doubt a national security issue. But the system held as long as information stayed scarce. And then it didn't. The internet didn't destroy Islam. It destroyed the informational monopoly that made Islamic authority unchallengeable. Scholars of Islam and the media have documented this shift for over 2 decades. Researchers like Dale Eichelman, John Anderson, and Gary Bunt have described how new media, first cassettes and satellite TV, and then internet and social platforms, didn't just spread religious messages. They multiplied the number of voices able to contest them. They created what scholars call new Muslim publics, fragmented, decentralized, impossible to control. Suddenly, a teenager in Cairo could compare a Saudi cleric's ruling with a Turkish scholar's interpretation and a secular legal framework from Scandinavia, all before breakfast. A young woman in Jakarta could watch a feminist tafsir discussion on YouTube, and then scroll to a Salafi preacher demanding that she cover her face, and then land on an ex-Muslim forum where people shared stories of leaving the faith, all within the same hour. And that comparison is the weapon. It's not atheism, not Western propaganda, just comparison. Comparison between moral systems, between gender norms, between countries where apostasy carries a death sentence and countries where doubt is treated as a normal phase of growing up. Between societies that enforce religious laws through morality police and societies that treat religion as an entirely personal matter. Between a cleric who says music is forbidden and a Muslim musician with 10 million followers. Between a fatwa banning women from driving and a Saudi woman posting videos from behind the wheel. The internet didn't create doubt. It just created options. And options are the one thing a monopoly cannot tolerate. And modern digital life makes this comparison automatic. We live in an era that trains people from childhood to customize everything. Personal feeds, personal playlists, personal brands, personal moral worlds. Large-scale values research, like the World Values Survey, has documented a global shift in many societies from survival values toward self-expression values, tied to rising expectations of autonomy, tolerance, and individual choice. When that expectation of choice reaches the realm of belief, Systems built on collective conformity face a test that they were never designed for. But here's where it gets complicated. Because the data, it doesn't show what most people expect. The loudest voices online will tell you Islam is collapsing, that millions are leaving, that mosques are emptying, that it's an avalanche. But it's not. According to Pew Research Center's landmark 2025 Global Religious Landscape Study, the Muslim population grew by 347 million people between 2010 and 2020, more than every other religion on earth combined. That growth was larger in absolute numbers than the entire global Buddhist population. Islam was the world's fastest growing major faith in that decade, driven overwhelmingly by demographics, higher birth rates, a younger median age, a population momentum from decades of growth, not by mass conversion. Pew's senior demographer Conrad Hackett put it plainly. The growth came because more Muslims are being born than dying. Religious switching played almost no role. 2 billion people now identify as Muslim worldwide, and that number keeps climbing. And when Pew looked specifically at religious switching in 13 countries with large enough Muslim samples to analyze, the results were striking. 3% or fewer of all adults had either left or entered Islam in most countries studied. In Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim majority nation, the share identifying as Muslim was essentially identical to the share raised Muslim, with fewer than 1% switching in either direction. Now, retention rates sat above 90% in most Muslim-majority nations, even in the United States. Roughly 3/4 of those raised Muslim still identify as Muslim in adulthood. So, no, this is not a story of mass exodus, and anyone telling you that Islam is dying hasn't looked at the numbers. But don't tune out yet, because what the data does show is far more destabilizing than just raw departure numbers. And it's the kind of shift that doesn't make headlines, because it's not happening in dramatic public apostasy, but in the quiet erosion of something that's much harder to rebuild once it's lost: trust. It shows volatility, fragmentation, and a slow grinding erosion of trust in the people who claim to speak for God. Arab Barometer, one of the most rigorous polling operations in the Middle East and North Africa, conducted large-scale face-to-face surveys across multiple countries and multiple waves, and they've tracked this shift in granular detail. Between 2013 and 2018, trust in religious leaders across the Arab world dropped from 51% to 40%. Trust in Islamist political parties fell even harder, from 35% to only 20%. The share of respondents describing themselves as not religious rose from 8% to 13%. And among youth under 30, that figure climbed to 18%. Look at the country-level numbers and the picture sharpens. In Tunisia, nearly half of young people describe themselves as non-religious, a number comparable to that of American youth. A third of young Libyans said the same, a quarter of young Algerians, a fifth of young Egyptians. And the share who believed religious leaders should influence government decisions was dropping steadily across the board. Meanwhile, Iraq presented a fascinating contradiction. Nearly half of Iraqis described themselves as religious, up from 39% in 2013. Yet the share who actually attend Friday prayers was cut nearly in half, falling to just 33%. People were claiming religion while abandoning its practices. Faith was becoming personal, detached from institutional obedience. As one Arab Barometer analyst put it, religion is increasingly personal. And then, just when it looked like a straight line towards secularization, the trend reversed. Arab Barometer's analysis in the early 2020s found that youth religiosity actually rebounded in several countries. Fewer young respondents described themselves as not religious. Engagement with religious texts, reading or listening to scripture daily, it went up. And the likely drivers? Pandemic stress, economic crisis, political instability, religion as a coping mechanism, as a source of community when everything else was falling apart, as it always has been during periods of crisis. So religiosity isn't a one-way escalator downward. It swings, it polarizes, it fractures into a spectrum of identities that didn't exist a generation ago, and that traditional survey categories weren't built to capture. Research from Turkey illustrates this vividly. One study found that only about a third of respondents define themselves as Orthodox religious, while a larger share identify simply as believers, and a significant cluster identify with categories of deism, non-belief, or religious indecision, the old binary devout or apostate. It's dissolving into something far messier and far harder for institutions to manage. The numbers didn't show extinction, they showed destabilization, and destabilization is far more dangerous than decline. If you're following the pattern here, be sure to subscribe, because what comes next isn't just about Islam. It's about what happens when any system built on enforcement meets a generation that expects consent. Here is the shift that changes everything. For centuries, you were born Muslim the way that you were born into a family name. It wasn't chosen, it was assigned. And the entire social architecture, law, community, identity, consequence, reinforced that assignment so thoroughly that opting out wasn't just difficult. In many places, it was legally impossible. That assumption is breaking, and Iran is the sharpest case study of why. The Islamic Republic census claims 99.5% of Iranians are Muslim. But a major 2020 survey by Gaman, the group for analyzing and measuring attitudes in Iran, a Netherlands-based research organization, told a radically different story. Using anonymous online methods, they surveyed over 50,000 respondents, roughly 90% living inside Iran. The results shattered the state's official narrative. Only 40% identified as Muslim. Let that sink in for a moment. In a country where the state says 99.5% are Muslim, fewer than half actually claim the label when they can answer without fear. 32% identify as Shia specifically, in a country whose entire government, constitution, and revolutionary identity are built on Shia Islam. 9% called themselves atheists. 7% chose spiritual. 8% identified as Zoroastrian, widely interpreted not as literal Zoroastrian practices, but as a statement of Persian nationalism, a deliberate rejection of imposed Islamic identity in favor of pre-Islamic heritage. 22% refused to identify with any category at all. And the political implications cut even deeper. 68% agreed that religious prescriptions should be excluded from legislation, even if believers hold a parliamentary majority. 72% opposed compulsory hijab laws. 47% reported losing their religion during their lifetime. Nearly 60% say that they don't perform daily Muslim prayer. Now look, online surveys do have methodological limitations. The researchers themselves acknowledge that, and the sample skews toward literate, internet-connected Iranians. But follow-up Gaman surveys in 2022 and 23, with samples ranging up to 150,000 respondents, found similar results. Roughly half identify with labels like atheistic or agnostic or spiritual or just no religion. The pattern held, and the sheer scale of divergence between the state's official narrative and what Iranians report when they can answer anonymously tells us something enormous. When religion is fused to coercive state power for decades, the backlash doesn't stay quiet. It redefines the entire relationship between faith and law. A religion can survive doubt. It can survive debate. It can survive mockery. But it struggles to survive when obedience becomes optional. And that realization forces every Islamic institution on earth to make a choice. Because there are only two paths forward. Path one is to adapt. Embrace what scholars call post-Islamism, not anti-Islamic, but a rethinking of religion's role in society and politics. Islam as a powerful moral and spiritual tradition that operates with personal autonomy and pluralist governance. Faith as conviction, not compliance. Religion as chosen, not commanded. Some scholars and movements are already pushing in this direction, emphasizing rights alongside faith, personal conscience alongside community belonging. This path doesn't destroy Islam, it transforms it. And arguably, it saves it, by making it something that people choose rather than something that they endure. Path 2, harden. Double down on enforcement, morality police, censorship, blasphemy prosecutions, harsher penalties for dissent, tighter control over digital spaces, surveillance of online religious debate. We've seen this playbook before. In Iran, in Saudi Arabia before its recent reforms, in Afghanistan under the Taliban. The enforcers always believe that if they just clamp down hard enough, the old order will hold. It won't. And history tells us why. When the printing press arrived in 16th century Europe, it didn't cause the Protestant Reformation, but it shattered the Catholic Church's monopoly on religious information. New interpreters reached mass audiences overnight. New ideas spread faster than any institution could suppress them. The old authority didn't vanish, but it was forced to compete in a marketplace of ideas that it never had been designed for. The historian Elizabeth Eisenstein called printing a communications revolution that transformed the scale and structure of religious contestation itself. Now, the Catholic Church responded with censorship, with the index of forbidden books, with inquisitions, and none of it worked. The monopoly was already broken. The internet is doing to Islamic authority what the printing press did to Rome, and the parallel is not perfect. Islam has no single papacy to splinter from, and the Muslim world is politically vast and diverse, stretching from Senegal to Indonesia. But the structural logic is identical. When a communication revolution breaks informational scarcity, religious authority must compete. or coerce. There is no third option. And here's the cruel paradox of the hardening path. Enforced faith produces compliance. Chosen faith produces conviction. Only one of those survives modernity. The more authority clamps down, the more it confirms the suspicion that belief requires force, and the more legitimacy it bleeds. That's exactly what Iran's data reveals. 4 decades of theocratic rule didn't produce a more devout population. It just produced a generation that associates religion with oppression. And this is where the title of this video stops being provocative and starts being structural. This is the first fully digital Muslim generation, the first raised with instant access to competing interpretations, rival moral frameworks, and global comparison. Not behind closed doors, but in the open, on platforms that reach billions. The first generation trained from childhood to expect customization, to curate their own feeds, their own identities, their own moral worlds. The first generation that expects consent over inheritance in every domain of life, including faith. That doesn't mean they're all leaving Islam. The data is clear, most are not. Globally, about 1% of those raised Muslim will leave the faith, offset by a comparable number joining. But they are redefining what it means to be Muslim in their own terms. Orthodox, reformist, spiritual, cultural, doubting, deist, quietly disengaged. The spectrum is wider than it ever has been. And it's being constructed not in mosques or madrasas, but on phones, in group chats, on platforms that the old gatekeepers can't reach. When a young believer says faith is personal, they're not just making a theological statement. They're drawing a line. They're saying, my conscience answers to God, not your institution. And when millions of young Muslims draw that line simultaneously, the entire political architecture built on inherited religious authority begins to shake. And critically, standard surveys struggle to capture this full spectrum, especially in countries where apostasy is legally punishable or socially devastating. Social scientists have long documented social desirability bias. People underreport stigmatized beliefs where fear of punishment runs high. In some Muslim-majority countries, laws explicitly prohibit citizens from leaving their religion, which doesn't just suppress switching, it suppresses the willingness to report it. The places where leaving Islam may be most significant are often the places where measuring is the hardest. That's not just a data problem, that's a political one. But one structural reality cuts through all the noise. Once monopoly authority is gone, it never fully returns. The internet has multiplied interpreters. It's also normalized comparison. It turned inherited identity into a question. And no amount of censorship, no morality police, no blasphemy law can fully reverse that. Islam is not disappearing. 2 billion adherents, 347 million added in a single decade. It's the fastest growing religion on earth. But Islam is a compulsory public order, as a system that governs courts, controls bodies, dictates political legitimacy, and punishes dissent. Well, that version is under siege. Not from the outside, but from within, from its own children, from a generation that grew up comparing, questioning, and choosing in ways that no previous Muslim generation ever could. And the institutions that see this coming, well, they're scared, because they know something that the headlines miss. You can fight an enemy, you can suppress a protest, you can even ban a book, but you can't unteach a generation that belief should be chosen. Civilizations rarely die in fire. They transform under pressure. The question isn't whether Islam survives, it's which Islam survives. The version built on enforcement and inherited obedience, or the version built on conviction, chosen freely, accountable for conscience rather than clerical command. That decision now belongs to a generation that refuses to inherit authority that it didn't choose. And if the compulsory version can't survive without force, well, then this generation may be its last. And that's not a prediction, it's a pattern, one we've seen before, in every civilization that tried to hold power through inherited belief rather than earned legitimacy. So what do you think? Is this the beginning of Islam's greatest transformation, or will the old order find a way to hold on? Let us know in the comments, and if this opened your eyes, subscribe to Fall of Nations. We break down the forces reshaping civilizations, one story at a time.